Landon Tate had never been the type of man who needed much from the world. The land was enough. It had been enough for his father and his grandfather before that. Spanning just under 80 acres of dry Oklahoma soil and gently sloping pasture, the property wasn't remarkable by modern standards, but it held more value to Landon than any bank ledger ever could. It was his place in the world, his piece of history. The same barns that once stored feed for his grandfather's mules now housed tractors and irrigation tanks. The same wind that swept through these fields had ruffled the hair of his father when he was just a boy, running barefoot through golden hay under a younger sun. The soil itself seemed to remember things. Where rows once grew tall and straight, where rain pooled, where tracks of cattle carved the earth. Landon respected it, worked it with quiet precision, and never once in 40 years thought of leaving. The farm wasn't particularly profitable, nor did it need to be. He sold produce at the market, kept seasonal contracts with 2 restaurants in Tulsa, and supplied feed to a neighboring ranch. His needs were simple. He didn't travel, didn't entertain, didn't care for distractions. The land required attention, nothing more, nothing less. And that rhythm was enough for him. He kept his tools sharp, his boundaries clear, and his business to himself. No social media, no welcome signs, no fake charm for tourists passing through. He wasn't unkind, just busy, and besides, most people these days didn't understand what it meant to be rooted. They floated, traded places like outfits looking for views and aesthetics, not meaning. Things began to change around 5 years ago when a development company bought up several nearby lots and broke ground on what they called the Ridge. It was a master-planned community of high-end homes with names like Juniper Bend and Clearview. Estates, boxy modern houses with floor-to-ceiling glass, artificial lawns, and a strict aesthetic code that banned things like wind chimes, mismatched fences, and backyard sheds. The kind of place that charged homeowners a monthly fee just to approve the color of their mailbox. Landon ignored it at first. The Ridge was uphill from his property, built on land that had been rancher-owned until a drought forced them to sell. He figured city folk would come and go, as they always did, find the land too dusty, the air too still, the quiet too loud. But they stayed. The Ridge flourished. New houses kept popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, and with them came the kind of neighbors Landon had hoped he'd never have to deal with. They didn't wave. They didn't ask before parking near his gate. Some of them complained about the smell of manure during planting, the rumble of tractors at 6 in the morning, even the dust that blew across the road on windy days, as if the farm had arrived after them, as if his century-old family legacy was some kind of inconvenience to their weekend wine tastings and Pinterest patios. Landon gritted his teeth through it. Let them grumble. His deed went back to 1902. They could stare all they wanted. But then came Karen, or, as her driver's license apparently read, Joan Martin. She bought one of the uppermost homes in the Ridge, the one closest to the fence line where Landon's main irrigation rig stood. Her lot was large, flat, and positioned with purpose. Giant glass windows looked out over the valley, a feature prominently advertised in the listing as having uninterrupted rural vistas. Except there was one problem. Her view included Landon's, fertilizer tanks, a rust-colored barn, and a slowly rotating irrigation arm that cut across the field twice a day. Joan Martin didn't like that, not one bit. The first time Landon saw her, she was standing on the edge of her property, arms folded, lips pursed as she stared down at his land like it had personally offended her. She was tall, severe-looking, with white blonde hair tied back so tightly it looked painful. She wore a white tracksuit and sunglasses even at dusk. Landon nodded politely. She didn't respond. The next morning, she called the county office to complain about an unauthorized industrial structure. which turned out to be his compost bin. 2 weeks later, she submitted another report to the planning board claiming that his irrigation system was causing a visual obstruction and possibly leaking into protected runoff zones. Landon received a notice by mail and a follow-up email from a junior clerk asking for a site map and tank specifications. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before in other towns, on other farms, people who moved to the country thinking it would be pretty, like a painting, like a postcard, but didn't want to deal with the actual functions of agriculture. They wanted the idea of a farm. They wanted stillness, not machinery. Landon answered the request, submitted the maps, and passed the inspection, but Joan wasn't finished. She began calling the sheriff's office with noise complaints. One time, she claimed his generator was emitting toxic fumes. Another time, she reported excessive vibrations during plowing. Each time, an officer came out. Each time, nothing was found. Eventually, the calls stopped going to the general desk. They were routed directly to Sheriff James Tate, Landon's cousin, though they didn't advertise it. James was fair, patient, and well-respected in the county. He followed procedure, but even he admitted this was bordering on harassment. Still, his hands were tied. If a complaint came in, it had to be addressed. Landon didn't argue. He just kept working. The crops didn't care about drama. The soil didn't respond to threats. Then, one Tuesday morning, as Landon was backing his truck out of the equipment shed, he saw the flashing lights. A black SUV with county plates was parked halfway into his driveway. James stepped out and looked immediately apologetic. "We got another one," he said. "This time, she's claiming you built an illegal structure that's obstructing the sunlight on her deck." Landon blinked. "You mean the south fence line?" "She says the new tank you installed last month is casting a shadow. Says it's blocking her sunrise yoga routine." Landon shook his head. It was absurd. The tank was 8 feet tall and positioned according to code. It wasn't even in her line of sight unless she climbed onto her own roof. But Joan, Karen, didn't care about lines, logic, or legalities. She cared about control. She cared about removing anything that didn't fit her picture of perfection. And she was willing to manipulate every inch of county bureaucracy to do it. James ran through the usual motions, snapped a few photos, and filed the visit as no violation. But the incident stirred something in Landon. Not anger, not exactly. Something deeper. A slow, steady burn of realization. This wasn't going to end on its own. Joan wasn't just a nuisance. She was a threat. Not to his safety, but to his peace. And that, for Landon, was the same thing. As he watched the sheriff pull away, the wind shifted and carried a thin, almost imperceptible scent of lilacs from her manicured yard. It mixed awkwardly with the earthy musk of turned soil and fertilizer. 2 different worlds, one polished, curated, fabricated. The other messy, ancient, alive. They couldn't coexist, not for long. And as Landon turned back to his field, to the rustle of wheat and hum of bees, he knew that sooner or later one of them would have to yield. He just hoped it wouldn't be the land. The official complaint arrived not as a knock at the door or a sheriff's cruiser in the drive, but as a registered letter tucked into Landon's mailbox one humid Thursday morning, slipped quietly between a flyer for tractor repairs and an old seed. Catalog, the envelope was heavy stock, expensive. The return address printed in embossed navy blue with an air of cold formality. Inside, the folded document announced itself as a preliminary notice of code review and property use complaint, citing a string of obscure land ordinances and referencing an unnamed complainant who had filed a petition for review regarding a potential misuse of rural development zoning. The language was dense, impersonal, laced with bureaucratic vagueness designed to intimidate and confuse. But Landon had been working this land for over 4 decades. He knew every inch of it better than most men know their own homes. And while he wasn't a lawyer, he understood harassment when he saw it, especially when it came wrapped in county letterhead and hidden behind indirect accusations. He read the document twice, slowly, then set it on the kitchen table beside the coffee pot and stared out the window toward the upper ridge. The sunlight bounced off the silver railings of Karen's deck, catching on the glass panels like a signal mirror. She wasn't outside, but she didn't need to be. Her message had been delivered. This wasn't about soil, or code, or zoning. It was about disruption. The slow, calculated process of wearing someone down not through violence or confrontation, but by forcing them into an endless loop of defense. Complain, inspect, delay, repeat. And this latest maneuver was her most deliberate yet. The code violation cited an agricultural structure, specifically the irrigation tank he had installed the previous season. The tank wasn't new, but its position had been adjusted after a previous storm took down one of the supports. Landon had moved it 6 feet to the east and reinforced it with concrete, well within his property boundaries and consistent with state agricultural guidelines. He'd even submitted the change on record as a courtesy, though not strictly required. Still, here it was, now flagged for potential encroachment, based on an anonymous photo that showed the tank visually disrupting the surrounding terrain. It was nonsense, and Landon knew it, but nonsense with a seal on it was still something you had to answer. He didn't call the county. He didn't march up the ridge with a piece of his mind. Instead, he did what men like him were raised to do: gather, prepare, document. He spent the rest of the day going through file boxes in the garage, pulling out receipts for the tank purchase, photographs from the installation, copies of the state zoning map that clearly marked his property lines. He printed the GPS coordinates of the tank's placement, measured manually and logged via his field software, and drafted a timeline showing when and why it had been moved. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon and the fields were washed in amber, Landon had a full binder assembled, marked and tabbed, ready for whatever desk jockey tried to make sense of it. But even as he felt the steady satisfaction of preparation, a knot sat in his chest. Not fear, but something more complicated. A frustration sharpened by the knowledge that he was being forced to defend the very ground his family had earned with sweat and time. 2 days later, the inspection team arrived. 3 men in county polos, one of them barely out of high school, the others older but clearly bored, irritated at the assignment. Landon greeted them politely, binder in hand, and walked them through the field, showing the tank, the markings on the ground, the original placement posts still embedded in the soil. The senior inspector, a man named Willis, flipped through the binder without much interest. "We're not really looking at placement here," he said finally, tapping the complaint form on his clipboard. This was flagged as a visual obstruction. Landon stared at him. "Obstruction to what? There's nothing behind it but sky." Willis shrugged. "The photo attached shows the tank visible from the deck of the neighboring property. The claim is that it blocks the horizon line during early daylight hours." For a moment, Landon thought Willis was joking, but the man's face was bland, unamused, as if years of similar nonsense had drained him of reaction. Landon resisted the urge to scoff. "It's an irrigation tank. It waters the fields. That's what this land is zoned for." "We're not disputing that," Willis replied, clearly uncomfortable. "But when a complaint is filed under Code 18C, subsection 4, we have to perform a site review. Doesn't mean there's a violation." Landon nodded slowly. "But it means there's a file now. A record." Willis said nothing. The visit ended without incident. No citations, no warnings, just more photos taken and more notes scribbled into a tablet. But the damage was done. Landon had seen this before in neighboring counties. The slow creep of policy becoming pressure, and pressure becoming leverage. One complaint turns into a record. The record becomes a pattern, The pattern becomes justification. It was a bureaucratic war of attrition, and Joan Martin, Karen, knew exactly what she was doing. And now that she had her hooks in the system, she would keep pulling. The following week, a second letter arrived, this time from the Department of Environmental Quality, citing a request for a preliminary impact review based on an anonymous allegation of contaminated runoff. No names, no evidence, just the suggestion that pesticide use may be contributing to abnormal soil saturation on the south slope, near the boundary shared with the ridge. Landon's pesticide use was minimal and carefully regulated, every batch logged and approved, but that didn't stop the agency from marking his case for on-site assessment. He'd spent years building a reputation for clean farming, partnering with local sustainable groups, attending every workshop, ensuring every supplier followed the law. And yet, in the eyes of a faceless system, one baseless accusation had the power to erode that overnight. It was late in the evening when Landon found himself sitting at the kitchen table again, documents spread before him, the hum of the fridge the only sound in the room. The dog lay curled by the back door, breathing slow, unconcerned. But Landon's mind ran circles. He couldn't fight this with fists, couldn't rip it out like weeds. He needed more than truth. He needed structure, backing, precision. So the next morning, without ceremony, he drove into town and walked into the office of a local law firm, one of the few that specialized in land defense and agricultural litigation. He sat across from a woman named Cheryl, late 50s, steel-gray hair and sharper eyes. He explained the sequence of events with calm clarity, ending with the latest letter from the DEQ. She listened without interruption, then leaned back and said, "I've seen this before. Usually it ends when someone runs out of money. Or patience." Landon didn't flinch. "Neither applies to me." She nodded. "Good, because this is going to take time, and we're going to need to document everything. Every visit, every letter, every inch of soil. We'll file a formal complaint of harassment and request public record of all filings tied to your address. If she's doing this through the county, there'll be a trail," Landon said. "And if she's not—" Cheryl's mouth curled slightly. "Then we make one." Outside, the sky had darkened. A storm was coming. Thunder somewhere in the distance. But Landon felt something steadier rise in him. Not fear or even anger, but clarity. She wanted a war, and now she had one. 3 weeks passed without incident, which in itself felt ominous. Landon had expected another letter, another visit, another hollow threat disguised as a regulation, but there was nothing. The county didn't call. The environmental inspectors delayed their site visit without explanation. Even Cheryl, the attorney, commented on the sudden quiet, noting that sometimes bullies pulled back to regroup or shift tactics. Landon wasn't fooled. The stillness didn't comfort him. It reminded him of the way the prairie went silent just before a tornado touched down. The air too still, too dense, like the world was holding its breath for something mean to come tearing through. It wasn't until the third Monday of the month that the next strike landed, and it did so with the kind of precision that told Landon it had been planned in detail. That morning, when he stepped out to check the main pump near the irrigation trench, he found the east gate hanging open, a chain cut clean and dropped into the grass. A section of fencing had been yanked free from the posts and lay twisted and flat, trampled by tire marks that curved through the brush and ended near the back edge of the lower field. There, right beside the path he used to haul water tanks, 3 of the main supply lines had been slashed. Not torn, not worn. Cut. The gashes were smooth, surgical, like someone had taken a box cutter or knife to them in the dead of night and disappeared before first light. It wasn't vandalism. It wasn't kids. It was a message. Landon stood there for a long moment, his boots sinking into the damp soil, the hiss of leaking water spitting quietly near his feet. He didn't swear. He didn't kick at the broken fence. He just inhaled deeply, let the air fill his lungs, and then turned back toward the shed, already listing off in his head what would need replacing, what fittings could be salvaged, how long it would take to reroute pressure from the secondary line. It was the middle of the season. The crops couldn't wait. Feelings had no place in irrigation schedules. He patched what he could that day and ordered the rest, spending more than he could really afford, but knowing it had to be done. And then, that evening, when the sun had gone low enough that the ridge above turned gold and the windows of Joan Martin's home reflected it like polished armor, he stepped out onto his porch with a pair of binoculars and stood silently. Her house was quiet, lights on, curtains drawn. No movement, but she had eyes. She had people. The next day he filed a police report, plain and methodical. James came out personally, took photos, logged everything, but Landon could see the tightness in his cousin's jaw as he walked the property line. They both knew the sheriff's office wasn't equipped to investigate soft sabotage. No witnesses, no cameras, no fingerprints. Just damage and suspicion. But Landon wasn't relying on the police. Cheryl had already filed a public records request on every complaint connected to Landon's land, and the paperwork was slowly coming in. What they found wasn't shocking. Dozens of minor filings, many anonymous, most frivolous. Noise complaints, chemical exposure concerns, even a complaint that Landon's scarecrow displayed threatening posture from the upper ridge. It was a campaign, petty, scattered, and persistent. Then came the billboard. On a Friday morning, a flatbed truck arrived just after sunrise and began installing a large vinyl sign directly across from Landon's southern field, on a strip of land owned by the Ridge Homeowners Partnership. The sign featured a stylized image of a family picnicking under blue skies with the words, "Preserve our view, protect our health." In smaller font below, "Join the petition against agricultural encroachment." No names, no direct references. But everyone knew who it was for. Landon stood at the edge of the road and watched as two contractors bolted the frame into the ground. When he asked what permit had been filed for a visual obstruction sign on a county road, they shrugged and said everything was cleared through the Ridge's internal zoning committee. That night, his phone rang. It was one of the restaurants in Tulsa that carried his produce, a small farm-to-table outfit that prided itself on clean sourcing. They told him, delicately, that they had received several emails from Ridge residents, unsigned but coordinated, suggesting his farming methods were environmentally questionable and potentially toxic to nearby homeowners. The restaurant wasn't accusing him of anything, but they were pausing deliveries for the time being, just until things cleared up. Landon thanked them calmly and hung up without argument. But as he sat back down at the kitchen table and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the same hum that had filled the room during his father's last year and his mother's long before, something in him shifted. Not fear, not even anger, resolve, cold and clean. He called Cheryl the next morning and laid it out plainly. They weren't just poking anymore. They were interfering. Financially, reputationally. She agreed. "They're building a case," she said, "or the illusion of one. That sign is public pressure. The complaints are a paper trail. You don't win this by defending the farm. You win it by proving a pattern of coordinated harassment." How do we do that? We start by going after the Ridge Board. Subpoena their internal records, meeting minutes, email chains, any references to your name or property. We'll need a judge, and we'll need to show this is more than coincidence. Will we get that? We might, especially if you get one more hit. That hit came sooner than either of them expected. The following Tuesday, Landon's supplier, the regional distributor who handled his fertilizer and equipment parts, informed him his account had been flagged due to a pending civil inquiry filed under the Environmental Health Disclosure Act. The source: An anonymous letter signed by a concerned community group, requesting investigation into his pesticide storage and alleging illegal dumping near the shared creek line. Again, there was no evidence, no names, but the inquiry was logged and public. His supplier, legally, had to suspend deliveries until it cleared. He hung up and sat in the truck for a long time, not moving, the field stretching wide around him, green and quiet and blameless. The sky was cloudless. The wind had stilled. It felt like standing in the eye of something slow and terrible, and knowing it wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. That evening, he drove into town again, not to file another report or make another call, but to visit the county recorder's office. He didn't bring a lawyer. He didn't ask for help. He simply requested a copy of the original property lines for the Ridge development, and cross-referenced it with the last recorded map from 1979, before any of the housing was there. What he saw confirmed something he'd suspected for months. The Ridge's main southern fence, including the corner where Joan Martin's property stood, encroached nearly 4 feet onto his land. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to matter, enough to act on. He didn't confront her. He didn't write a letter or leave a note or fire a warning shot over the fence. He handed the documents to Cheryl the next day and said only, "This is yours now." She smiled. "Let's see how they like paperwork." Outside it began to rain. Not hard, not fast, but steady. The kind of rain that soaks in slowly, reaching roots and breaking dry ground. The kind that stays. The formal demand letter was sent by Cheryl on a Monday morning, neatly packaged and delivered by certified mail to the Ridge's Development Board, and, by name, to Joan Martin. It was worded with surgical precision. Not aggressive, not personal, just matter-of-fact. The Ridge's southern fence, including the decorative stone columns on the southeast corner of Joan's property, stood beyond the legal tiki boundary of Landon's land by a measured distance of 3 feet and 8 inches, confirmed by 2 separate surveys and county records. The letter gave them 15 business days to remove the encroaching structure or face civil litigation for property invasion, forced removal, and damages. It was a clean shot, measured and lawful, designed not to provoke, but to corner. Cheryl explained it to Landon as a necessary escalation, not just to reclaim the land, but to shift the weight of pressure. If they wanted to play the legal game, it was time they started losing. For the first few days, nothing happened. The fence remained, the columns stood tall, and the billboard across the road still loomed like a polite accusation. But by the end of the week, subtle signs began to emerge. The board issued a short response through a real estate lawyer based in Tulsa, asking for mediation options. Cheryl replied flatly that mediation would only be considered after the physical removal of the fence. Joan Martin, for her part, made no direct communication. She didn't respond through counsel, didn't file a counterclaim, didn't issue a public statement. But she did make a move. One morning, Landon found that the billboard had been taken down. No trucks, no noise, just gone, as if erased overnight. No replacement, no explanation. Still, he didn't relax. If anything, the silence that followed the letter was heavier than before. He continued to work the land, driving the perimeter with more frequency now, inspecting every post and valve, double-checking the irrigation pressure and grain levels. He spoke less to neighbors and spent more time in the fields, not because he feared anything immediate, but because instinct told him that something was shifting beneath the surface. It wasn't just Joan anymore. It was the board, the lawyers, the whole machine that backed her. They were recalculating, and that made them dangerous. 2 days later, the retaliation came. It arrived not with threats or vandalism, but with bureaucracy. A county official drove out to Landon's farm in a gray sedan with magnetic decals on the side, carrying a clipboard and an apologetic smile. He introduced himself as Randall, a representative from the Office of Zoning and Rural Land Use, and explained that a formal request had been submitted for a full compliance review of Landon's property under the Rural Reuse and Soil Conservation Act. It was an obscure piece of legislation that allowed for complete inspection of any land used for agricultural purposes if certain keywords were triggered in complaints, terms like environmental mismanagement or runoff inconsistency. Landon didn't need to ask who submitted the request. He walked Randall through the property, showing him every tank, every trench, every point where runoff was directed into the containment ditch. The man was polite, thorough, and not especially eager to be there. Landon answered each question without flair, handed over every record Cheryl had helped him organize, and watched as the inspector scribbled notes into a worn binder. It took 3 hours. At the end of it, Randall said only, "You're in the clear, far as I can tell, but this'll generate a report. Might want to be ready for that to circulate." Landon nodded. He already was. What struck him, though, wasn't the inspection itself. It was the timing. The county didn't move quickly. For a request to be filed, reviewed, and assigned an inspector within a week of the letter going out meant that someone on the Ridge Board had pulled strings, which meant that Joan, or whoever was directing her legal counsel, still believed they could bury him under processes, even while they backed off from the billboard and refused to acknowledge the fence. That evening, Cheryl called with a tone sharper than usual. "We got partial access to Ridge Board communications," she said. "Not everything, but enough. The subpoena worked. There are emails referencing targeting problematic parcels and strategies for visual optimization of south-facing properties. Joan's name comes up more than once, and they referenced your tank. Not the placement, but how to encourage relocation through zoning constraints. They're playing City Hall like a fiddle. Is that enough for court? It's enough for a countersuit. Harassment, economic interference, strategic abuse of county resources. But that's not the best part. We found something in Joan's property file. When she bought the lot, the Ridge Board guaranteed her full, unobstructed sightline to the south, in writing, which of course wasn't theirs to promise, because that land is yours." Landon didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the kitchen window toward the edge of the ridge. It made sense now. The intensity, the desperation, the sheer persistence of her actions. It hadn't been just about the tank or the fence or the smell of compost. It had been about the view. The board had promised her something they couldn't legally deliver, and rather than admit it, they had tried to push him out, inch by inch, code by code. Cheryl continued, her voice calm but electric. "She's sitting on a real estate lie. If this hits court, that clause becomes a liability. Not just for her, but for the Ridge development itself. Every homeowner with a similar guarantee becomes a risk." Landon said only, "Good." They agreed to proceed with the lawsuit. As night fell, a warm breeze swept across the field, rustling the tall grass in a slow, whispering wave. For the first time in weeks, Landon stepped outside and felt something close to balance. Not peace, not yet, but control. Not through power, not through force, but through proof, through quiet persistence, through outlasting. That was the game now, and he was still standing. The filing went through on a gray Tuesday morning under docket number 27C9985, Tate v. Ridge Homeowners Partnership et al. It was official, public, and irreversible. Cheryl had worked late the previous night finalizing the language, and when she called Landon to confirm, she didn't waste time on ceremony. "They're going to know it's war now," she said flatly. "No more behind-the-back filings. We're not reacting anymore. We're striking." The lawsuit wasn't just about the fence anymore. That had become the doorway. Now it included counts of property encroachment, coordinated harassment, and willful misuse of public regulatory systems. Landon didn't fully understand all the legal framing, but he understood the intent. They were turning the entire strategy of slow suffocation back on its architects. And for the first time since the feud began, it wasn't just about pushing back, it was about taking ground. The county courthouse had barely posted the case summary online when the first response came. Not from Joan, and not directly from the Ridge Board either, but through a new legal team. Larger, slicker, corporate. A firm out of Dallas that specialized in residential developer defense, which sounded to Landon like the kind of people who knew how to manipulate zoning law faster than most men could read it. Their first action was to file a motion to dismiss the harassment claims as overstated and speculative, a boilerplate tactic meant to discredit Landon before discovery could even begin. But Cheryl was ready. She filed a counter-motion with attachments from the board's own internal emails, carefully selected, carefully phrased, and absolutely damning. The judge denied the dismissal within 2 days. Joan, predictably, stayed silent through it all. No statements, no interviews, no Facebook rants, which Cheryl joked was a sign that the new lawyers had muzzled her. But silence wasn't the same as surrender. In the weeks that followed, Landon began to notice things shifting again. But not on paper, on the land. First, the traffic increased. SUVs from the Ridge began using the narrow back road that ran parallel to his eastern fence line, a dirt stretch barely wide enough for one vehicle. The road had never been officially part of the Ridge's layout. It was a leftover service lane from the original farm division. But now, day after day, cars drove slowly by, as if inspecting. Windows down. Phones held up. Some lingered, parked just far enough away to avoid trespassing but close enough to observe his every movement. One woman even brought binoculars, which she used without shame as Landon repaired a broken fence post near the creek bed. When he stared at her, she smiled and waved. He didn't wave back. Then came the letters. Not legal ones, anonymous ones. Typed in uniform font on plain white paper, mailed without return address, postmarked from the next town over. They arrived every few days. One warned of public health consequences. Another accused him of operating an unlicensed chemical facility, which Cheryl laughed at until they received a third letter claiming subsurface contamination that may affect the Ridge's water table. That one couldn't be ignored. Cheryl forwarded it to a hydrologist she trusted, who confirmed there was zero basis for such a claim, but warned that if a formal environmental filing were submitted, it could trigger a mandatory review. That would cost time, and time in farming meant lost yield. At Cheryl's recommendation, Landon installed additional boundary markers along the fence, hired an independent surveyor to recertify his land's dimensions, and began logging every interaction, every passerby, every suspicious occurrence in a notebook kept in his truck. He didn't carry a camera. He didn't stake out his land with floodlights or motion sensors. That wasn't his way. He trusted paper, logs, names, dates. Because what he was building now wasn't just a case. It was a record, a full ledger of interference, harassment, intimidation. And every time one of those SUVs crept past or another typed envelope slid into his mailbox, he didn't feel helpless. He felt clarity. They were overplaying their hand. But the Ridge wasn't done. The most brazen act came 2 weeks into summer. Landon returned from a feed run to find 2 workers on his land, dressed in branded polos from a landscaping service based in the city. They were unloading gravel near the lower slope, right at the edge of the contested boundary, preparing what looked like the foundation for a walking path. When he confronted them, they looked confused, even embarrassed. and said they had been contracted by a community project fund through the Ridge Board to install an eco-trail extension for wellness purposes. They had a work order, but no map, no permit, and no idea they were on private land. Landon ordered them off immediately. When they hesitated, he didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped forward, calm and steady, and began removing their equipment himself, lifting bags of gravel and placing them over the boundary line. That did the trick. They left without argument. The next day, Sherrill filed an emergency injunction against any Ridge-affiliated activity within 20 feet of his property, and the judge approved it without delay. A letter was also sent to the landscaping company's legal department. They responded with a formal apology and a promise to investigate internal miscommunication. Landon didn't care about the apology. He cared about the fact that the Ridge had begun using third parties to violate his rights, possibly hoping to shift liability or provoke a reaction. But provoking him wouldn't work, not anymore. Word of the lawsuit began to spread beyond the county. A land use advocacy group from Tulsa reached out, offering resources and media attention. Sherrill advised against engaging the press, for now. But she did suggest something more strategic. If Landon was willing, she would initiate a request for amicus brief participation, meaning outside organizations could lend expert testimony or support without directly joining the case. It would show the court that the outcome wasn't just about one farmer's fence. It was about precedent, abuse of regulation, targeted pressure through legal systems. Landon agreed. The judge granted full discovery. That meant both sides now had to turn over every document, every communication, every policy relevant to the claims. Sherrill's team dug in with surgical focus, combing through thousands of emails, board minutes, vendor contracts, zoning requests, and internal memos. What they uncovered was worse than expected. Not just mentions of Landon's land, but specific language discussing eliminating visual disruption, applying incremental pressure, and creating a record of conflict. One email even joked, "Let the old man litigate. We've got the HOA budget." That email was printed, highlighted, and clipped to the front of their exhibit binder. Meanwhile, on the land, things stayed tense but quieter. The Ridge seemed to retreat slightly, possibly under legal advice. The SUVs stopped circling. The fake trail was abandoned. But the tension remained. A taut wire stretched between two ways of life. Joan Martin didn't remove her fence, not yet. Her lawyers filed a motion requesting mediation. Sherrill refused. Not until the fence is gone, and the board issues a written admission. Landon backed her fully. He didn't want compromise. He wanted restoration. Then, near the end of the month, the tide shifted. The county board announced that due to growing scrutiny over Ridge's practices and pending litigation, they would launch a formal audit of all zoning variances approved in the last 6 years, including every sightline easement, lot adjustment, and visual restriction clause. The announcement was made quietly, through a public memo, but the implications were massive. If even a handful of Ridge homes were based on flawed or deceptive zoning promises, lawsuits would multiply. Joan's home was now radioactive. No one would buy it, no one would touch it, and she knew it. She sent an offer through her lawyers. They would remove the fence, pay all legal fees, issue a formal statement that no visual easement ever applied to Landon's property, and withdraw from the board. In return, Landon would drop the harassment claims. Sherrill read the offer aloud over the phone, then waited. Landon sat silent for a long time. The sun was setting over the fields, casting long shadows over the soil. Finally, he said, "Only if they rebuild the boundary line themselves. Post to post. No subcontractors. I want them in the dirt." Sherrill didn't hesitate. "Done. The work began on a dull morning with low clouds hanging over the fields like a lid pressed tight. A small team arrived at first light, not hired laborers or contracted landscapers, but actual board members from the Ridge, including Joan Martin herself. Cheryl had insisted on the clause during settlement, not as humiliation, but as consequence. If they had chosen to invade Landon's land with calculated, coordinated actions cloaked in policy and regulation, then they could face the dignity of undoing it themselves. And so there they were, 3 men in khakis and windbreakers, and Joan in spotless white sneakers and designer gloves, stepping gingerly onto the dirt where the old fence had stood. They brought tools, clearly borrowed or new, stiff with unused shine. Landon watched them from a distance at first, leaning against the front of his truck, arms folded across his chest, unreadable. He said nothing. They saw him, but didn't wave. He didn't expect them to. That wasn't the point. They began by measuring out the correct boundary markers under supervision from a county officer assigned to ensure compliance. The original posts had long since been uprooted or absorbed by landscaping decisions made in private meetings with cozy architects who never expected to be challenged. But the old survey lines were there, etched deep in the land and confirmed by 2 independent surveyors who'd signed off with silent satisfaction. The new fence would go in cleanly, post by post, on the line where it belonged. The act of building it, simple and physical, felt almost sacred in contrast to the quiet warfare that had preceded it. By noon, sweat soaked through the backs of shirts, and Joan's white gloves were brown with soil. She didn't complain, but her face wore the strain of someone profoundly unused to being held to account in such visible terms. Her steps grew heavier, her breath louder. At one point, she stood upright and glanced toward Landon, who still hadn't moved. He hadn't smiled, hadn't jeered, hadn't done anything but witness. She looked away first. Later that afternoon, Cheryl arrived on site with a folder under her arm, a plain black one, thick with paper. Inside was the formal withdrawal of all zoning requests that referenced Landon's property. The official statement from the Ridge Board disclaiming any right to visual management over neighboring lands, and a notarized agreement that none of the Ridge's funds or systems would ever again be used to interfere with Landon Tate or his estate in any form. Oh, it was bureaucratic poetry, dry, precise, and absolute. The statement would be entered into county record the next morning. Landon signed it without flourish. Cheryl slid the paper back into the folder and nodded once, short and final. They stood in silence, watching as the last few boards went up, each strike of the hammer dull and tired by now. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The Ridge Board had gotten what they wanted once. Quiet dominance, seamless control of the landscape they had purchased in arrogance. But now the illusion had cracked. The boundary had reasserted itself, not just on paper, not just in court, but in the physical world, where it could not be moved by marketing promises or fabricated complaints. It stood in the ground now, tangible, unyielding. That night the wind shifted. A warm breeze came in from the west, stirring dry leaves across the gravel and lifting the faint smell of tilled soil. Landon sat on his porch, a cup of black coffee in hand, dog asleep beside his chair. The fields stretched quiet before him, vast and untouched. No billboard, no traffic, no strangers with cameras. The land had returned to silence, not the uneasy kind that precedes attack, but the honest kind that follows justice. He thought of his father then, not as a memory, but as a presence, as if the man were still leaning against the barn door with one boot up, watching fence lines and thinking thoughts he rarely spoke. He taught Landon that land was not just something to own. It was something to keep, to carry, to protect. Not out of stubbornness, but out of respect. And now, after everything, the filings, the sabotage, the silent campaign of slow pressure, the land was still his. Not because he fought dirty, but because he refused to be moved. Joan Martin left the Ridge 2 weeks later. The house went up for sale quietly, listed below market, no mention of sightlines or views. The property sat stagnant for months. No one wanted it. Whispers of the lawsuit had spread, and buyers knew better than to step into a place so recently scorched by exposure. Landon didn't gloat. He didn't track the listing or ask about offers. He simply worked. New seed went into the ground. New contracts were signed. The restaurant in Tulsa came back, quietly at first, then with a stronger order than before. By the end of the season, Landon had recovered what he'd lost, and then some. His name was clean, his fence was straight, and the Ridge, while still there, still full of glass and steel and soft hands, had gone silent. No more complaints, no more letters. They knew now where the line was, and who would hold it. Autumn came earlier than usual that year, and with it the land changed. The heat lost its bite, the wind cooled, and the morning haze settled lower across the fields like a soft breath held close to the earth. The soil, dark and obedient, responded eagerly to the shift, drinking in the last of the summer warmth before sleep. Landon moved through the season without hurry, each day deliberate, each task steady. There were no more letters, no more inspections. No SUV headlights at the edge of the eastern road. The Ridge, so recently a hive of whispering hostility, had faded back into the background noise of life, distant and irrelevant. Joan's house remained unsold, the property marked down again, now listed with disclaimers. Buyers came, brows furrowed, asked pointed questions, then walked away before offers could be made. Whatever vision of suburban serenity had been promised was gone, broken by court records and boundaries that could no longer be pretended away. Landon didn't track the listing. He didn't need to. The house became its own message, a symbol of what happened when false guarantees collided with rooted truth. He had no anger left for her. Not really. It had burned away in the quiet hours of paperwork, in the deliberate gathering of facts, in the long drive home after signing court documents that put the matter to rest. Justice, when it came, hadn't shouted. It had settled in, solid and slow, like frost creeping into dry ground. The people who had watched from the sidelines, neighbors, vendors, even a few Ridge residents, understood something fundamental now. Landon Tate was not a man to be moved, and his land was not a prize to be shaped by aesthetic. As preference, in town people treated him a little differently, not with pity or fame, but with a quiet nod of respect. The clerk at the feed store asked if things had settled down. The woman at the post office slipped his mail into a separate stack, careful not to bend the edges. Even the sheriff, James, dropped by one afternoon with a sack of apples from his wife's orchard, handed over without fanfare. Landon accepted it all with the same calm he wore through every season. He didn't need congratulations. He needed the quiet, the rhythm, the certainty of boundaries, both physical and personal, held and honored. Cheryl continued to manage the last administrative filings. They still spoke once a week, reviewing developments, discussing enforcement, but increasingly their conversations drifted to other things. Weather, yield estimates, local elections. She told him once that cases like his rarely ended this way. Not because they couldn't, but because most people gave up before the pressure could be reversed. He hadn't. She called it a victory. Landon just called it necessary. One evening, long after the first frost, he stood near the rebuilt fence line, boots pressed into hard earth, hands in his jacket pockets. The posts stood straight now, clean, spaced perfectly, built by those who had once tried to erase the very border they were now forced to reinforce. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about pride. It was about permanence, about memory, about honoring the hands that had laid those lines generations ago with nothing more than string, steel, and trust. The land had not changed. Only the people who tried to claim what was never theirs. Somewhere behind him, the house lights flickered on, warm through the window. The dog barked once, low and tired, then curled back beneath the porch. The sky was a bruised canvas, deep purple over fading gold, and for the first time in months, Landon exhaled without weight on his chest. It was over. Not loudly, not publicly, but truly. The fight had passed, the noise faded, and what remained was exactly what had always been his. Not just the land, but the right to shape it, tend it, protect it. And as the cold settled in for the long months ahead, the fields around him lay still and strong, waiting for spring. Just like him,